All right, so this stuff here, I just want to reiterate what I asked you to read yesterday, okay? The section is about experimental design, okay? And the ethics that go along with that, okay? So a little bit of morality here. There's two types of statistical experiments, okay? There's actually an experiment, or I guess studies, okay? Statistical studies. There's experimental and there's observational, okay? Observational is the idea that there is already something occurring or something that's already occurred. So this could be post, in terms of time, it's done after something has already occurred. The observational means that you basically, as a researcher or as a statistician, are just, well, you're not trying to manipulate anything. You're just recording data of something that has happened, and then you're trying to decide and determine if there is any connections between variables. Experimental is different. Experimental is that you actually set up an experiment. You actually break people up into groups. You develop a control group, you develop a treatment group, and you actually do the experiment. Does that make sense? Okay? So when you're asking your homework, is this situation an experimental study or an observational study, you got to ask yourself, okay, is somebody actually manipulating something here? Are they actually doing an experiment, or are they just watching as an outsider, okay, as a bystander, and just kind of trying to see, collect data, do the mathematics, and then determine inferences from that? Does that make sense? Okay. What this section kind of talks about are questions like this. Does aspirin reduce the risk of heart attacks? Is one brand of fertilizer more effective at growing roses than another? Is fatigue dangerous to driver as the influence of alcohol? Questions like these are answered using randomized experiments. Okay. For instance, like those things would not be necessarily observation. Okay. If I'm trying to determine fatigue being as dangerous as the influence of alcohol, maybe I set up some scenarios that would be safe. Okay, so I don't want to harm any of my experimental units, my individual people, but I would set up maybe an experiment that mentally fatigues people or physically fatigues them, and then run them through some type of like fine motor skill assessment. Does that make sense? And then I would intoxicate some people, okay, and do the same thing, and I would see some variations in between those two groups. And I would also have a control group that has neither of those things, just a normal operating person, no fatigue, no intoxication, and I would run them through, and I would be able then to do statistical analysis on the data that I got from them. Yes?
So you see that game show where they keep people awake for like 36 hours or something and then make them count?
It's dangerous. There was a guy a couple years ago, it was last time that the World Cup was played. He wanted to watch every game. He was Chinese. He wanted to watch every game from the World Cup. So he would like DVR them when I was at work. So he'd work all day, DVR them, and then he'd go home and he'd watch them. Dude never slept, died.
That sucks.
Fact, it would. He got watched most of the games, but you can die from fatigue. Yeah, die from not sleeping. What? I've never seen that. No.
Oh, they keep them awake and they make them count coins. And whoever gets the closest to the actual amount of coins, like, stays in, and then they do like more challenges to test them because they're so tired.
Yeah. That sounds like maybe the worst show ever to watch.
The last person wins all the coins, but except they don't.
Is it like?
Just the coins. They give them a check for the amount of coins.
Oh. Well, what if they wanted the coins? What if they're like really into rolling coins or something?
They probably would let have that they don't have to get more coins.
Probably. That's a good idea. All right. So questions like these are answered using, like I said, randomized experiments, and we'll talk about the randomization here in a little bit. We'll talk about some procedures that are going to kind of guarantee reliability of our data and our calculations. Okay. So key questions are: what's the purpose of a statistical experiment? Okay. It is to investigate a relationship between variables. Okay, it is to see if aspirin does cause an impact on heart attack rates. Okay, it is to see if fatigue has an impact on fine motor skills. Okay, so we're going to see if the variable of fatigue impacts the variable of fine motor skill proficiency. Does that make sense? Okay, so that is the purpose of an experimental study. So key terms, so we're going to have what we call explanatory and response variables, and they are, by definition, what they sound like. Okay, the explanatory variable is going to be the variable that causes something. We have an explanation for why are my fine motor skills, why are they deteriorating? Okay, well, my fine motor skills would be the response, and their deterioration would be the response to the explanatory variable of fatigue. Does that make sense? Okay, so explanatory is the variable that we are trying to see, does varying its degree impact another variable, the response. Okay, if I'm talking about the aspirin influencing heart attack rates, my aspirin, the dosage of aspirin, and maybe even the frequency in which I give it or take it would be the explanatory variable, and the response would be either the increase or decrease in heart attack rates. Does that make sense? Okay, so response and explanatory variable, they are linked, and those are the things that we're trying to study. Okay, now we talk about treatments. Treatment, you're going to hear in all studies talk about what are the different treatments that are being given. Okay, now treatment doesn't necessarily, we think about treatment, we think about medication, right? Okay, or a therapy or something like that. It doesn't have to be something like that. Okay, a treatment might be, I took this group and I made them fatigue. I deprived them of sleep. Okay, so the treatment would be sleep deprivation. Does that make sense? Not something that actually helped them, but it's basically what did I do or what have I provided for this group versus the other group. Okay, so a treatment is the different values of the explanatory variable. Okay. The experimental unit is, so if I take 400 people and they are part of my sample, each person then of those 400 are referred to as an experimental unit. Okay, so if we're going to do an experiment on you guys, maybe we're talking about fatigue and fine motor skills in driving, each one of you as a driver would be an experimental unit inside that experiment. Does that make sense? Okay, so sample is the collection. So we got population is who we're trying to develop an idea about, a conclusion about. It's impossible for us to get the whole population, so we take a sample, and that group then is the sample, and then each individual part inside that sample is an experimental unit. Okay, does that make sense? All right. This next statement says, you want to determine if vitamin E is effective in disease prevention. Okay, so these are types of things you got to think about when you're conducting a study or you're reading a study and trying to interpret the validity of it. Okay, we talked about this morning that and this is valid. There's a lot of research out there on this. Do you guys like what's your cereal brands that you guys like? Fruity Pebbles, Cocoa Puffs, Cinnamon Toast Crunch. Okay, what kind? Cheerios. Okay. A couple years ago, it's probably a year and a half ago, came out on the nightly news that there was a study done on Cheerios, Cheetos, some other grain-based foods, snacks, cereals and snacks, that talked about the amount of Roundup that was making its way into your cereals or your snacks like Cheetos, and then ultimately creating cancerous results in consumers. Okay, so Roundup is made by Monsanto, and they, if you know anything about Monsanto, they actually just a guy, he's like 56 years old, I think he was, just won a huge lawsuit against them, like $60 million because he used Roundup, he got cancer, and Roundup didn't preface that their product could give you cancer. But they're like they are like the major like manufacturer across the world for herbicides in agriculture. So when farmers spray their fields to keep like aphids and all kinds of other infested bugs off their or crops, and also so insecticides and herbicides, there's traces of that make it into the grain, right? Does that make sense? And then that gets ground up, and there's traces of that ends up in the product that you eat. Now the FDA says that there's a threshold that is acceptable. Okay, you guys have all heard that stuff, right? Like there's acceptable amounts of like mouse feces that's allowed to go into food, okay, for be consumable, and it's disgusting. And but there are like acceptable ranges of like parts per million that the FDA approves of and says this is okay. Well, that comes out that these products are having a lot more of the accepted value of Roundup essentially in the consumable food than what the FDA was allowing. And like I said, it's causing cancer. We would want to make sure that when we do that study that there are not any other outlying variables that could come into play, because it would really stink to write a research about Cheerios having the potential to cause cancer, and then later a study get done and say, no, that was completely false. Now the person that wrote that first study created so many lawsuits against Cheerios. Cheerios lost all this money, but then it turns out that it wasn't true. Does that make sense? Okay. So there's a lot of times with these studies, there's a lot of maybe financial and legal aspects to them, or kind of byproducts of these studies. So we always want to read and think and do our research. You're reading one study is good, but if there's multiple studies, you read multiple studies. Okay. If they're researching something and there's 1,000 studies about the same thing, we use what's called meta-analysis, which is collecting all the data from all those things and then running like research on all that data from all the research. Yes?
So somebody it's like double like Cheerios, if the study is wrong, Cheerios can find out.
So I don't know how that all works out litigation-wise. I mean, there'd probably be court cases and all that kind of stuff. There are like peer review boards, and there's just international review boards of statistical studies that before they get published, people will review them and make sure that there's no issues or minimal issues. And we'll talk about that towards the end here. But if I read this, they said, you want to determine the vitamin E is effective in disease prevention. You survey 40 people inside a local GNC, and you find that the subjects who take vitamin E exhibit better health than those who do not take vitamin E. Does this prove that vitamin E is effective in disease prevention? Okay. So here's my question. If I'm in GNC, what kind of people, well, first of all, when I do this survey of 40 people and I'm in GNC and I am surveying people about vitamin E, what kind of sampling technique is that?
Wait, what is GNC?
GNC, what's GNC stand for?
Geriatric.
Yeah, it's like they sell supplements and vitamins and that kind of stuff. They used to do one of them all, yeah. I don't know what it stands for, but Bryce stands. Okay, so GNC, what kind of people are in, so if I'm surveying people as they walk into GNC about vitamin E, what kind of sampling am I doing? Convenience, okay? And convenience is inherently biased, right? Okay, so I would want to know that as a researcher, or I would want to know that as just the audience of some paper that is reading, or a person that is reading somebody else's work, right? I would want to know, okay, how is this sampling technique done, and then knowledge of the bias that goes along with that. Another issue here, okay? If I'm in GNC, what kind of people go into GNC? What? Ripped people, right? Most of the people that go into GNC are your workout fiends, right? Your people that are already extremely healthy. Does that make sense? Okay. They're people that are really concerned with that. So if I go in and I interview these people or survey them about if they're going to buy vitamin E or the effectiveness of vitamin E for their health, is there anything there that might be kind of confounding or create an issue in regards to being able to narrow down that vitamin E was the reason for their health being good? Yeah, a lot of those people are already on diets, right? Or a lot of those people are already exercising every day. A lot of those people are already taking other supplements and vitamins and that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of stuff there that could be the reason for their good health other than vitamin E, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So when we're doing these types of things, these types of studies, we have to be able to see those, observe those, recognize those, okay, and then try to eliminate those types of variables, all right? It'd be like if I were, let's say I'm researching the study about the herbicide or insecticide in Cheerios causing cancer, but the sample that I chose was a bunch of kids that live in a city that has a nuclear power plant, okay, or like Chernobyl or something like that, right? Okay, would that be maybe a variable that could produce the cancer instead of the Cheerios that they're eating? Does that kind of make sense? So I'd want to be aware of all those. Those are called what we call lurking variables, okay? They're additional variables that can cloud a study, okay? And sometimes they're variables that exist that completely ruin a study, okay? Sometimes people will go through a study, they'll go through a process, and they'll think they got rid of all lurking variables. There's one they were unaware of, and it creates their outcomes of their study, and they make the link in their study that the explanatory variable was the reason for their outcomes, but this lurking variable that was behind the scenes that nobody knew about, nobody saw right away, was actually the reason for the outcomes, okay? So we don't like lurking variables, and the way that we can remove lurking variables is to do randomization, okay? Let's think about this class. Let's say that this class is, let's go use the GNC thing, okay? In a population, you have people that are really healthy, you have people that are not healthy, you have people that exercise, people that don't exercise, you have people that are, have underlying diseases, right? Well, if I put all my people that have underlying diseases in one group, and all my people that are super healthy in another group, okay, and then I start doing my study on those people and try to determine, does vitamin E create better health? Because I put all my sick or diseased people in one group, and I'll put all my healthy people in another group, the lurking variables exist in an unproportional way in which they're going to cloud whether the vitamin E creates good health or not. Does that make sense? So what we want to do is we want to create these groups when we do our experiment in which each group has healthy people, has people that are not healthy, has people that have diseases, has people that are very fit, that kind of thing, okay, that exercise, so that the randomization creates groups in which all the lurking variables are evenly distributed amongst the groups. Does that make sense? When your lurking variables are all evenly distributed across the groups, then that narrows our focus and allows us to say we can concentrate on the explanatory variable and the response variable now. Does that make sense? Okay. So we can't eliminate the lurking variable. We can't just say, oh, diseased people or healthy people, we're not going to work with you. Okay. We spread them out evenly across the control group and the treatment group, and then that mitigates the fact that a lurking variable has an impact on the outcomes. Okay, because the statistical analysis and the calculations, the numbers that we're going to get are all shared or similar attributes now because of that randomization. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. One thing we got to pay attention to is power of suggestion. Okay. Power of suggestion. If I say, in a survey, why is chocolate milk bad for you? Okay. I already put in your mind, in the survey, I already put in your mind what I'm trying to convince you of, that chocolate milk has a negative impact on health. Does that make sense? Okay. So even the wording of certain questions can persuade somebody to think a certain way and to respond a certain way. Does that make sense? Okay. There are questions like if I, let's say, wanted you to fill out a survey about the quality of teacher I am. And I gave you, I am great, I am good, and I am okay. And those were my three options. I eliminated the negative things, right? Okay? So by removing options, I inherently create bias inside my data. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Power of suggestion goes into the idea of the way we phrase questions. Okay. It also goes into the idea of if I give you medicine. Okay. Let's say that we have two groups of people, and we're going to do a study on the effectiveness of aspirin. And I tell this group, let's say this side of the room, you guys are getting aspirin. Okay? You guys are not getting aspirin. Okay? You guys are going to get a pill, but it's just water. It's inert. Okay? It's sugar, water, whatever. Are you guys, because you know what you're getting, okay, that's going to create psychological effects that either are detrimental, they're overall detrimental to the study, but they might negate the actual improvement that the aspirin gives, or they might negate the psychological aspect that we're trying to study or recognize with giving the inert treatment. Does that kind of make sense? If you know, like let's say you guys are the control group, you guys are the treatment group, so you guys are getting the aspirin, you guys are not getting the aspirin, but you don't know that. You don't know you're not getting the aspirin, okay? And you take it thinking, okay, it's not aspirin, but I take it, and I think it's aspirin, or any medication, okay, it's called the placebo effect. You've heard this before, right? Psychological, chemical releases in my brain, that kind of thing will create improvement in my health sometimes, okay? We want to make sure that that's a variable that is not a lurking variable that is the cause of improved outcomes, okay? Does that make sense? So what we do to eliminate that is we give this group, this control group, an inert substance, okay? So we can measure the outcome of the treatment group against the outcome of the inert substance group. Does that make sense? Okay. If they're the same outcomes, let's say both groups got better, one given a water pill, the other one given the actual medicine, they both got better, and they both got better by the same degree. Does that tell me that medicine was kind of crap? Because you're just giving this group water and they would have gotten better, right? So that was the placebo, the effect of thinking I'm taking a medication, and then ultimately making me better, okay? But if I give the control group a water pill, give the treatment group a medicine, and there is a drastic difference in the medicine group, okay, where their survival rate or their health shot up dramatically compared to the control group, can we then say that the medicine group, the medicine was actually the explanatory variable for that response? Does that make sense? Okay. So that's kind of what we talk about with power of suggestion. Even if I'm working with somebody, okay, who's working inside a study, and I know as the head researcher or the doctor or whatever that is administering the medication, because I know who's getting what, my interactions, my conversations with the control group people might be, whether it's conscious or subconscious, might be completely different than my conversations, interactions with the treatment group. So we want to minimize that kind of stuff. Does that make sense? Because my interactions with, let's say Lucas is in the control group, let's say my interactions with him, because I know he's just getting the water pill, maybe I don't go in depth with him in regards to like his illness or whatever. Does that make sense? Okay. But let's say Brooklyn is in the treatment group, and because I know she's getting the medicine, I ask her a lot more questions, and it's more, she kind of sits there and thinks, okay, I think I'm getting a real medicine here. Does that make sense? Then that can psychologically create with her different outcomes. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, my interactions there are, that's the power of suggestion, okay? So we want to minimize that. So what we do is, one, like I said, we create a control group so we can measure whether the power of suggestion is there or not, okay? And we can determine the effectiveness of actual treatments. But we do what we call blinding, okay? So I'm skipping over a little of these. You guys read these in detail here, and just talking now about these concepts, but we talk about blinding, okay? Blinding means you don't, either the researcher or the patients themselves do not know about what they are getting, okay, or what they are giving, okay, what treatment is happening, okay? Think about this. If I broke you guys up into a control group and a treatment group, and I told control group, hey, you guys are getting water pill, treatment group, you guys are getting the real medicine, and you knew what you were getting, can that lead to like false outcomes, false measurements of like the explanatory and response variables, okay? So we blind things, and a lot of times it's a single blinded test, which single blinded is it's like the bare minimum of what we want to do in like a medical research is the fact that you as the patient don't know what you're getting, okay? That way it eliminates the psychological power of suggestion, okay? Now, think about this, and I've always kind of wondered this or struggled with this, but as you sign up for these like studies, you know this, you fill out paperwork that says, hey, I'm aware that I may or may not get the actual drug, okay? And if, like, let's say that I'm in like a treatment group for like a vaccine. They're doing vaccines right now, right? So what they'll do is that they will have a control group that's getting a vaccine of maybe just like saline solution or something like that, or sugar or whatever you can put into a vaccine that won't hurt you. And then the other group will actually get the vaccine. Does that make sense? Okay, and we'll see, our antibodies then created with that treatment group. I sign up for that. I don't know. I might get the legit vaccine and I might not. Okay, but I'm aware of that when I sign up. Does that make sense? And why do people sign up? What is a thing that people want? Yeah, people get money for this. Okay, so right now in Cleveland they're doing some studies. My sister used to be a pharmacist up there, and she said that she's got some friends up there that are getting like $1,500 to get into these vaccine programs, just to get a shot and see, do you create antibodies? Okay, and like every time that they get a shot, it's like $1,500 or something like that. But they will somehow give people incentives to do that. If you've got like some people with like terminal illnesses, they will get into study like experimental studies for drugs. Okay, and what they will do is a lot of times if you get into an experimental study like that, they will actually pay for the drugs for you. They'll pay for your hospitalizations and that kind of stuff. Does that make sense? So there's reason for you to maybe jump into that other than living, okay, or the chance of living. So blinding is a good technique for determining whether we can eliminate some of these lurking variables, especially the placebo effect and the power of suggestion. Double blind is like the hallmark of how we do medical research studies. And what that means is not only do you as the experimental unit not know what group you're part of, the head researcher and the doctors that are working with the people, they don't know either. Okay? And basically what happens is that all names become numbers, all medications become numbers, and then they link numbers with medication, and then somebody that is like working for the head researcher, like an undergrad student or something like that, or a tech, they then end up being the person that's able to correlate those numbers and recognize, oh, this person A, they are from the control group, person B, control group, person C, they were in the treatment group. Does that make sense? So nobody knows. So now my interactions with Lucas or Brooklyn, they're identical because I have no idea. Does that make sense? Okay? And then you can't be persuaded one way or the other. What's that? Yeah. So that's double blind. Right now, you heard maybe at the beginning of the school year, maybe around the beginning of August, they started to really ramp up this vaccine stuff. And they started talking about, well, we don't have double-blind studies to validate whether these vaccines are effective or not. That's what they're trying to do. Okay, they're always, when they talk about these things and the effectiveness of them, they'll always talk about using a double-blinded experiment or double-blinded study, because that's the best way. Does that make sense? Okay. Dr. Fauci talked about that stuff all the time. You guys watch the news or anything like that? To get into that, there's a lot of stuff that's relatable to what we talk about in this class, in the news, and especially right now. What's that?
I'm only watching Crappy Brothers right now.
Crappy Brothers?
Property Brothers.
Oh, Property Brothers. Crappy Brothers. I guess that's kind of similar. All right, so we've got an example here. It says researchers want to investigate whether taking aspirin regularly reduces the risk of heart attack. Okay, 400 men between the ages of 50 and 84 recruited as participants. The men are divided randomly into two groups. One group will take aspirin. The other group will take a placebo, water pill, sugar pill, that kind of thing. Each man takes one pill each day for 3 years, but he does not know whether he is taking aspirin or the placebo. At the end of the study, researchers count the number of men in each group who have had heart attacks. Okay. Now, like I said, I always struggle with, well, crap, I got the water pill for 3 years and I got a heart attack. I could have gotten in the other group and maybe not had a heart attack, right? But you know those things before you enter the study. Okay. So you know that you're taking that risk as a participant here. I don't know. It depends on who's doing the study. So sometimes like the large, like Pfizer or Bayer, these large corporations these pharmaceutical corporations, they got a lot of money, so they might. It just depends on who's doing the research. Here it says, identify the following values for this study. The population. What group of people are we interested in determining or investigating this thing about aspirin with?
400 men, 50 days.
Okay, be careful. 400 men, says 400 men between the ages of 50 and 84 are recruited as participants. So those would probably be more my what? That's going to be my sample, okay? So the population here, because I think we have to maybe do a little bit of assuming. But the sample is 400 men between 50 to 84, right? That were recruited as participants. The population has to be, remember our sample has to show the same characteristics as our population, right? So men between 50 and 84 is probably the best way of describing our population, okay? I don't know, and we kind of discussed this maybe in first period a little bit, I don't know that I would say that it's just adults, okay? Because would my sample be characteristic of all adults? No, because some adults are female, right? Yeah, and younger. So some adults might be 30. Some adults might be 25, right? Okay. Some adults might be 102. Okay. So at that, in that situation, our sample, like I said, needs to be characteristic of the population we're interested in. So that's probably what we're looking at: men from 50 to 84. Okay. Now the next one says, what are your experimental units? So you got your population, men 50 to 84. You got your sample of 400 people, so that's another group, right? Experimental units is now dwindling that down smaller, and it's each individual person. Does that make sense? So each of the 400 men is considered an experimental unit when I look at them as themselves. Unit refers to the number 1, right? Okay, so it's one object out of the sample. It says, what is the explanatory variable? Okay, and what is the response variable? I like to look at these together. Okay, we are trying to see what variable, what condition is being targeted here with giving aspirin. Are we trying to determine whether heart attacks go up or down? that rate of heart attack, right? So that's the thing that could be changing in response to giving aspirin, right? Does that make sense to everybody? So if you can find out what is changing in response to something else, you now have your response variable. So I like to find my response variable first, okay? Because it's just easier for me to see, okay, what's the response, what was essentially the treatment to get that response, and then that tells me essentially what my explanatory variable is. So my response is trying to lower heart attack rates, okay, by giving aspirin, right? So the aspirin would be the reason or the explanation of why heart attack rates go up or down. Does that make sense? So heart attack rates is the response variable, and the aspirin would be the explanatory variable. The explanatory variable then is the thing that you can alter, okay? We can create control group, which would be just getting your inert pill, okay? And then we can create other groups. So as we're doing this, we create a group that we just say, hey, you guys are getting this aspirin, 1 aspirin a day, okay? But my thought is, if I take 1 aspirin a day, okay, is that going to have a little bit different effect on me, just 1 aspirin a day? Let's say 200 milligrams. Is that going to have a different effect on me than it is Riley if she takes 1 aspirin a day? Why? I'm bigger than her, right? Okay. And so what they usually will do is your milligrams will be proportional to, because our medicines like that are given off weight, right? Okay. Based on the weight of the subject, you go get you get your wisdom teeth out and they give you like pain medication. That's all predicated essentially off your weight. They don't want to give like an amount of sedative that would knock out a horse to a person, right? Okay, so they wouldn't want to give Riley, who's much smaller than Mr. Fay, the same amount of medication they give Mr. Fay because it might just completely shut her down, right? Does that make sense? Okay. But that would be the variable that you can control. All right. Ethics of this, and then we'll talk a little bit more. We'll talk all year about the ethics of statistics. I like this phrase. We've all heard the phrase that numbers don't lie. Okay, and that's true. That's a fact. Give me the numbers. Give me the facts, right? But the way that we spin those numbers, the way that people use those numbers, can produce lies. Okay, so the numbers don't lie, but the people that use them do lie. Okay, and that's always something we got to think about. Now, there are it's called the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, and there's multiple review boards. There's peer review. If I'm doing something as like a lot of universities, especially like, your big state universities will have people that do research, right? They'll have professors that do doctorates, have doctorates do research. Their research is then published and reviewed by their peers and determine whether it's quality or not, right? Does that make sense? Now there's a website. It's called retractionwatch.com, and that's not the only one, but it lists research that has been found out to be fraudulent. They've done surveys, they've done studies, and they publish something, but it's then found out that that person skewed the data, or that person for some reason maybe incorporated, whether intentionally or unintentionally, too much bias in the way that they conducted their research. Okay, so if something ever comes across the media, what's the media do? Something comes out right away, it goes on the media, right? Okay. If you were to go back to like the media clips and reference this, you could probably see a lot of things that show up on this that were also on the media.